Hi guys, we're going to go ahead and go over the first assignment that you did last week, the name, the test, or interval. So I put the answer key just document into the Canvas so you can check that. But if you had any questions over any of those problems, then we're going to go over those now. Okay, otherwise you can just fast forward to whatever part you want to watch and get your questions answered that way. All right, so let's remember that confidence intervals are estimating how much or how many of something. They're estimating an actual amount. Okay? And hypothesis tests are that testing yes or no, you have significant evidence of a claimed suspicion. Okay, claimed hypothesis. You think something's gotten bigger, something's different, okay, than the previous claim. All right. So first of all, on your number one there, it did say how much more likely. So because of that, we know that we had that confidence interval. Okay. And we are just talking about how much will last, for how many of those, what proportion of those restaurants will last for at least 1 year. So it was just, but we had two different kinds of restaurants, chain restaurants and then the non-chain restaurants, okay? So then that played into why it was two proportion. Okay, number two, how likely is it? So we were estimating that amount of how likely that is. So that's how you're getting a numerical estimate of how likely it is. So hence, that's why it's a confidence interval. And we are just talking about that one proportion. It's a proportion because it's talking about did you stop or did you not stop? You did or you didn't. That's categorical. That's a proportion. All right. So are the tourists more likely to rent that boat? And then we compared the North Shore resorts or to the tourists and the South Shore. So in this case, you could envision, that you were going to have an alternative hypothesis where you would see if you had evidence to reject the null and go with the alternative that says, yes, I have evidence that it is significantly more. Okay? Now, it was a proportion because we were talking about renting a boat or not renting a boat. Okay? So we would get the proportion of each tourist group that rented a boat. What percent, and sometimes we have to be careful when it says a percent, because sometimes it might be talking about, everybody gives me a percent number, and then what I'm going to be doing is averaging those percents. So sometimes just because it says percent doesn't automatically mean we go to the fact that it's a proportion. Okay? But in this case, since it's talking about opening their doors, okay, then yes, they do, or no, they don't. So that would be a proportion, the proportion who open their doors out of the total. And it wants to know this amount. What percent? Okay, estimate that amount. All right. Our number 5, we were talking about the car and motorcycle chases. So we were talking about those two events, and we were comparing that time. So therefore, we had a mean. Okay. We also were saying, hey, we weren't saying how much more is one than the other. That's an amount. You're saying, is it more for motorcycle than car? Or is it less or less time? I think it was. The average time is less. So that was an alternative hypothesis. We were seeing if we have evidence of the alternative hypothesis test for two means. Number 6, how much more exercise does this group get than the Reno group? How much more exercise? And we were going to be measuring the number of hours, so that's a quantity. So we have two means, and we're getting that amount difference between them, estimating that amount. Number 7 is talking about recovery time. Is the recovery time shorter? So do you have evidence that this is shorter than this? Shorter meaning a amount of time. So we have a quantity. So the average of one being shorter than the average of the two. Checking for evidence, hypothesis test, comparing those two different means. Are women more likely than men to ask directions? So this is they ask directions or they don't ask directions. So that's a proportion of that population or that sample, to make that estimate that or to make that claim that ask directions. So we are comparing. It doesn't say how much more likely are they. That would be an amount. That would be an interval. But it says, are they more likely? Yes or no? Do you have evidence of the alternative? Number 9. Again, we want to see if what the researcher suspects is actually true. So we want to see if we have evidence that the average is greater than 7 now. And so we're going to take that one sample's mean and do a test on it to check to see if we have evidence of the alternative. Okay? About what percent? Estimate that amount. About what percent? That's a confidence interval. Own a car. So this is going to be own a car or don't own a car. So this is the proportion of the college students who own a car. Number 11, how much more productive? So this is an amount. I want a numerical value of how much more one thing is than the other. Okay, so I'm estimating this difference. Now, what is this difference between? We're talking about their productivity. So I guess that's an amount. And so we're going to take the productivity amount with and the productivity amount without. So we have this one sample of 120 employees, and we paired them to compare each employee's productivity to themselves. So that's why you have a confidence interval for that paired data. All right, now, does do more than 98%? See if you have evidence that more than 98%. So that's your alternative. We're talking about those who have the H1N1 vaccine stay free. The swine flu, or I don't know if those are the same. The H1N1 flu. So this was the hypothesis test. Is the alternative, do you have evidence of the alternative? One proportion, stay free of the virus. What proportion who got the vaccine stay free of the virus? All right. Now we have this new vaccine for AIDS that's being tested. It claims 80% efficacy, and so we want to see if it's going to stay at 80%, or if this new vaccine is more effective. So we have the alternative. We're testing to see if that. Didn't say how much more effective. It just said, is it more effective? The proportion that do not get AIDS. So we do have one sample of 45 students in this problem. And we were talking about their let's see, the hours that they spent indoor and outdoors, okay? So we were going to compare that meant for each one of those students, we got a number for indoor and a number for outdoor, so we compared those amounts, okay? And it said estimate the average amount, so that's what makes it an interval, and of course paired data because it was the same students outside and inside. Are more than 10% of households now without landline phone service? Some people may be like, what is landline? Okay, but we used to have just hooked into the wall of the house and no wireless. So let's see. This is one where we had a claim. The null hypothesis would be 10%, and we want to see, is it now more? Okay, so do we have evidence of the alternative that it is now that proportion that are without landlines, so that's a proportion amount. Okay, and how much faster? That's your estimating, so that is your interval. And we have two totally independent groups. We have the 520 sports cars, the 890 economy cars, and we are talking about the how much faster? So we are talking about their speeds. Okay, and so that would be an average that we would be getting of those two average speeds. All right, 17 are unemployed, more likely to commit a felon. So your alternative is that these two things are equal, and alternatively, we want to see if one thing's more than the other. And do we have evidence that one thing is more? Now, it's talking about two different sets of people, those 500 unemployed people and 20,000 employed people. And we're talking about commit a felon or do not commit a felon. So that's proportion who commit a felon out of that group of subjects. Okay, so that's two hypothesis test for two proportions. Next is the average greater than 5, so that's your alternative. You are seeing if you have evidence of that alternative. And it is just one sample, one mean, to see if that one is one sample of 850 average is higher. Number 19, we do have two separate surgeries, the new technique and the old technique, okay? And we are talking about, we want to see the infection rate. So we're going to see if they developed an infection. So developing an infection is they got, so this is why we have proportion. They got an infection or they did not get an infection. Okay, so we are seeing, is one less than the other? Is the new technique lower than the other? We're comparing those. Alternative, do we have evidence of the alternative? And we have two proportions. Okay, got infected out of the total. And finally, I see we have two different groups of students, so two independent groups. So that's two samples. And we're talking, so this is an interesting one because we're talking about a percent of time. Okay, so first instinct is to say, oh, this is a proportion problem. But what happens is I would get an answer from every one of these subjects. So I would have 130 numeric percentages from those college students, and I would have 150 percentages from those high school students. And I would be taking those and comparing the average of the college students, so the average percent of time for college students, to the average percent of time for the high school students. All right? So that's a tricky one because even though it says percent, it is comparing the average percent of time spent thinking about sex. Probably not the best topic to have in a problem, so sorry about that, but there you go. All right, so the next video that I will do is going over the warm-up for this so that you are then ready for your quiz in Canvas.